This was a really lively debate. It wasn't just a discussion. There were two really quite opposed views, so people felt really quite passionately.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this in the third series of Westminster Faith Debates. We're absolutely delighted that you are here this evening. We're discussing a very difficult and problematic topic this evening. The subject is, are attempts to promote worldwide religious freedom naive or necessary? And it really gives me a great deal of pleasure to begin the session by introducing Linda Woodhead. As I said, she's Professor at Lancaster. She directed the Religion Society Research Programme. She is really an outstanding authority worldwide on what has been happening to faith across the world and what the state of faith is in the world today, certainly in Britain, but also much more widely.
Religious freedom is very much on the agenda at the moment. It's something relatively recent. It's been something that's been US-led. The US is investing very heavily now in the drive to monitor religious freedom in every country in the world and to push religious freedom forward, to increase the amount of religious freedom. In many ways, this seems like an unqualifiedly good thing. Who could be against religious freedom? Who would support persecution? Who would support coercion when it comes to something as important and intimate as belief or non-belief? Surely that should be our own free choice. And yet, the more the drive has intensified recently, the more we're starting to hear some voices raising questions and some critical concerns about what might actually be going on. And there are some very big issues that we want to debate tonight. Whose religious freedom are we talking about? What is religious freedom? And how does religious freedom conflict with other rights and goods? So it's my very great pleasure to start by introducing Professor Elizabeth Beth Shakman Hurd, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University. She's come over especially from Chicago to be with us today. And the reason we were absolutely determined to get Beth is that she is perhaps the leading voice in the United States at the moment, critically interrogating the whole notion of religious freedom.
And as you know, religious freedom sounds good. It's intended to guarantee human flourishing, peaceful coexistence, economic prosperity. But I'm going to actually suggest that it is quite possible that religious freedom contributes to exacerbating the very problems that it claims to resolve. And I'm going to just set out three considerations for you to think over, having to do with society, politics, and religion, looking at these three basic fields. And I'm going to suggest that the promotion of religious freedom corners and religion, confessionalizes politics, creates a world of faith communities, and creates a gap between religion that's promoted and advocated for and the rest of the world's religion. People and groups are described, and they're often, this is codified, they're legally defined in religious or sectarian terms, rather than on the basis of other affiliations. And the effect is to overemphasize religion as a basis of identity, as an identity marker, and as a basis for claiming rights. Basic categories, then, of social conflict and coexistence are framed in religious terms. Social tensions that have many complex causes are reduced to sectarian conflict and sectarian explanations. The process of legally protecting religion overcodes boundaries between groups. It makes them more rigid, it makes them less porous, it makes them more real, and it naturalizes them. When this happens, they become more available to be mobilized by people in power for various political reasons and to put in place various particular political agendas. And we're seeing this in Syria right now, which we can come back to later. We see a world populated by faith communities with strict hierarchies and leaders who are appointed to represent them, marginalizing others. And we see a gap between the religion that is inevitably chosen or selected or privileged by the authorities and the rest of the world's religion, which is messier, more improvised, maybe not as likely to curry favor with the government or whoever's in power. So those are the dynamics I would ask you to consider as we think about these programs. Thank you.
Next, we're going to turn to Jørgen, or Jørgen as he's properly called, because he's Danish, probably, Nielsen. He was trained in Beirut, and he is an expert in Arabic and Middle Eastern studies and Arab history. If I ever want to know anything about the Arab world, I will always send an email to Jørgen. But in the latter part of his career, he's been a professor at Copenhagen University, and he has become also the leading expert on Islam in Europe.
Let me briefly start by being fundamentalist. Yes, worldwide religious freedom is necessary. There are the formal reasons, the various international conventions, the United Nations, and the parallel, of course, in the European Declaration on Human Rights and so on. Quite apart from all the other reasons, religious freedom is actually necessary for the religion itself. Without religious freedom, the establishment of the elite, the institutions of an established religion will tend to reinforce themselves and close the doors to renewal of thinking and so on. And it's not surprising, therefore, that the people who often find themselves most limited by the absence of religious freedom in countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia are the many Muslims who dissent from the official forms of Islam. But it's not that simple. The problem, as Elizabeth has already indicated, is that religious freedom is just one aspect of the complex of interdependent freedoms. It's made explicit in the various international declarations and so on. The interdependent freedoms, apart from the freedom of religion and belief, remember these two are always put together in the international texts. It's not just religion, it's religion and belief. There are freedom of thought and conscience, freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, not to mention a number of freedoms from, such as slavery and discrimination and so on. And laws of blasphemy can provoke tensions between freedom of religion and freedom of expression. But why in this complex, why privilege religious freedom, especially when it is freedom of religion and belief?
Our third speaker is Baroness Berridge, Elizabeth Berridge. She's chair of the all-party group on international freedom of religion or belief, and she sits on the joint Human Rights Committee of the Houses of Parliament as a member of the House of Lords, and is therefore very well placed to comment on this general discussion about human rights, which we've already moved into.
And the first point I'll make about the title of today's debate and the all-party group that I chair is that religious freedom is for all. Whether you're sitting there saying I'm an agnostic, you've exercised a choice there. But I want to say to you pragmatically this evening that freedom, worldwide religious freedom of religion and belief is necessary because of global technology. Now people are, unless you're going to be North Korea, people are exposed to messages in a way they never have been before in our history. Once that is beginning to happen and once that works, you will see a fluidity of people's views globally that is going to necessitate people understanding I have the right to believe or not believe. So it's a human right, it's your right, and you're probably exercising it sitting here today. So it's not the province, it's not a religion's right, it's an individual's right. The reality is that there is a declining trajectory of this. 75% of the world's population live in countries where there are high or very high restrictions on religious leadership. If we don't understand global religious freedom and that it's religious freedom for all, you will end up with global identity politics. And that is Christians speaking on behalf of Christians, Muslims speaking on behalf of Muslims, and you will end up segregating people. I have been deeply challenged as a Christian myself, and I challenge people all the time. Why is it that the church is not leading on this and is the first voice onto the airwaves when the Rohingya Muslims are in trouble, not just when the Pakistani Christians are killed outside a church? Thank you very much.
Our final contributor is Alistair Burt, who I've known for a very long time. He's a Member of Parliament for North East Bedfordshire. He's a Conservative who has been a very outstanding Member of Parliament in many different ways. He was Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, Minister at the Foreign Commonwealth Office until October last year.
Let me state some practicalities as far as I can see it. I also agree that I think religious freedom and, above all, tolerance is necessary. It may be naive. Being naive is not necessarily wrong, but it won't necessarily get you the best results if you attack things in a naive manner. But tolerance is vital. Tolerance is vital for the development of any society in a whole variety of areas. And I don't accept the argument that religious freedom is elevated above the other fundamental rights that colleagues on the panel have set out, which are also protected. I don't see why religious freedom should not be one of those. The full development of a society, a women's place in society, is often bound up with religious intolerance or the practices of religion that damage women. Secondly, it helps to avoid civil strife. And I'm one who has recognised throughout history that, frankly, faith and religion are there to be abused by people of power to make people do things. That does not, however, fundamentally undermine what religion and faith is about. There are plenty of good things going around that are abused for all sorts of purposes. It doesn't mean that the object itself is necessarily a bad thing. What you have to do is curb the abuse. Fundamentally, I don't think there is a serious argument here. Promoting religious freedom, allowing people to be free for their beliefs, a fundamental part of human rights charters and the UN Charter, I think is there to be supported and defended. It can be abused, and in prosecuting it, if it is abused, then that is a failure of man, not of faith. But religious tolerance, the ability to support each other, is important.
What has struck me is the different picture of what's going on here that's come across members of the panel. Is it about a whole range of freedoms, including religious freedom? Is it about individuals' ability to live in a society where they can practice their beliefs as they wish to do so? Or is it about favouring particular religions because of the power of government and the way it operates in those ways, and excluding others?
There is a risk, there is a temptation that just because somebody says they are being persecuted for religion's sake, everyone has to believe that's the case, when in fact it's not. Equally, however, there are circumstances when it is, and when people are being targeted for no other reason than they are the other in a society.
9 times out of 10, the reality is that it is not, in some cases, not about religion at all. That's a front. In other cases, in the majority of cases, it's about religion plus, as you're indicating. I mean, there's an enormous complex relationship between religious identity on the one hand, religion both as an institutional collective identity and as an individual belief and practice, and they overlap with ethnic national identity.
When the international community and the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom in particular here has singled out the Rohingya as persecuted Muslims, and that was the discussion earlier. They're persecuted Muslims. We need to give them religious freedom. What this does is it says the Rohingya are persecuted Muslims. The problem here is a lack of religious freedom. And what this does is it actually reinforces, tragically, the narrative of the 969 organization, which is the exclusionary monks organization that is working to push the Rohingya out of Burmese society, out of Burmese politics, out of the state entirely, to get them to leave. When we single them out as Muslims, when we pull that out of the picture and privilege that and make that the operative feature, we are actually reinforcing the very dynamics of religious discrimination, social discrimination, and exclusion that we are supposedly trying to remedy.
There is a racial, clearly, when you look at the Rohingya Muslims, there is a racial element to that. But I sometimes think that this has been the dialogue and why we've ended up in this situation. We're too shy to say, actually, predominantly these people have been targeted because they are of a particular religion. That might also mean, because of what I outlined first, that they're also a particular ethnic group. But they have been targeted because of that. And I think the shyness to say that has affected and left a lot of people vulnerable who, when they describe what has happened to them, and that is obviously some of your best evidence, whether you're in Nigeria, they describe it as, I have been targeted because I am a. Now, that might be an ethnic description that we hear as religious, but they do say that.
But you're very often dealing with parts of the world that have a long history of being at the wrong end of our stick. There's a widespread belief that the West, be it the US or Europe, especially the ex-imperial powers, that when we start talking about the spread of human rights, of democracy, and now religious freedom, that this is in some way or another an instrument in our quiver of foreign policy of power instruments.
This is something that Americans believe in, and so this is why it's so important to think about it very deeply. The US is where religious freedom was invented. Now we're exporting it. That's the idea. This is a powerful myth of American exceptionalism. The US is where religion goes to become free. This is the notion. This is why there is so much traction.
I think we're using the word religious freedom in very different senses, from a very minimal to a very maximal one. So Alistair had a very minimal definition, which is allowing an individual to be able to pray and worship and believe. That's absolutely minimal. Very few people would object to that because you can do it entirely in private. But what about allowing them to pray and worship collectively in a big group? Do people have a right to do that? So it's not just about individuals, it's about groups. What about if that group is the majority and they have historic privileges like the Church of England in this country? Is that contravening religious freedom because you've got a privileged establishment? Many Americans would think that that is. And you mentioned free competition, and that's raising the bar even higher. So there's a whole level of more and less strenuous things that we're meaning by it, and I think we're shifting quite a lot of ground as we talk between those levels of defining what it is we're talking about and how big or small it is.
My question is for Professor Shakman Hurd. I presume that as an American citizen, you really value the many freedoms that you have under the Constitution. I can't understand why you don't regard those as equally important for the citizens of the rest of the planet.
I'd like to ask Beth actually to clarify whether she's arguing that we should abandon the religious freedom project or whether she's arguing we should sort of turn down the volume on it.
Now, I am not in the business of saying that we need to get rid of it. I don't presume to put myself in that position. I think we need to understand it. We need to understand its history, and we need to understand the kinds of effects that it has in the world legally when it's being instrumentalized or operationalized.
Are not both of these problems perhaps can be addressed, the exclusion of secular views often and the tendency to run away with religious freedom as a sort of activist agenda? Can they not both be addressed by bringing the right back to its full Article 18 terms of freedom of thought, conscience, religion or belief?
I am totally sort of on board with in terms of the context of religious freedom, is freedom of religion or belief. It's your choice to be an agnostic, to be a Jedi Knight warrior, and it's about the individual saying that. We've just had a landmark case in the UK court. Scientology has now sort of challenged our traditional understanding of what is a religion. People will self-identify like that, and that's why I so strongly want to say it's not about the government.
All laws, all legal systems, including international law, are inhabited by majoritarian assumptions. They are not abstracted from the world. They are part of history. They were written by particular people in particular times and places, and the concepts that they used and relied on need to be studied and understood, and we cannot simply say that these exist out of time. They don't.
And the answer I always give to my friends in other parts of the world when they try it on and say, oh, this is a Western construct, is to refer them to the Human Rights Charter and the Charter of the United Nations that they were happy to sign in order to become members, and say these are universal. So don't pin this on us that it's all about us. You've signed up to this. What do you think it means?
You've got an equally complex case in the by now iconic Lao Tse Tu case in European Court of Human Rights, where an individual claimed that her family religious freedom was being restricted because of the presence of a crucifix in the Italian classroom. In the end, the European Court on Human Rights in its full apparition decided to throw the case out, although the case had support both in the Italian courts and in the initial chamber decision.
If the crucifix is on the wall, if you're forced to leave it up, you're violating religious freedom. If you're forced to take it down, you're violating religious freedom. This is where we get to these complexities and some of the sacrifices.
The reason the case was thrown out, because it was wrong to bring the claim. It is ridiculous to extend religious freedom to as far as they were seeking to do, and somebody was able to say it was. We've all got terribly afraid of value judgments and everything else. Every now and again, somebody will make a claim, they will defend it to the death, but it will be barking. And it needs to be rejected.
Is that a technical term?
Well, we all know what we're talking about. I'm not an academic, I'm a politician, so I can say these things.
The Lauzi case was about a law requiring every classroom in Italy, which had a secular constitution, to display a crucifix. It was not barking to bring such a case. The judgment in the lower division of the court was logical and sensibly argued. The judgment by the Grand Chamber was back to front and illogical and was brought under huge political pressure.
When you mention the statistics about religious freedom is violated in 80% of the world population, which circulate in the American kind of industry, which feeds into the American policy, it's clearly not talking about this minimalist idea of religious freedom. But it's basing this idea on the idea that you can have religious freedom only if you have a state-church separation as the exceptional case, unique in the world of the American experience has.
I'm not sure really where tolerance, that has been so well advocated by Alistair Burt, fares in relation to the protection of the young and their individual rights.
We have the debate going on here at the moment about female genital mutilation. The debates have gone on at various times in various European countries about male circumcision. Just a month ago, Denmark banned halal and kosher slaughter. Where do you draw the line? I think the key word here is what society deems.
Do not in any way mistake my view that you can have religious tolerance and an understanding of the basic freedoms of people as saying that is a complete get-out-of-jail-free card for any practice which society deems to be wrong. And it would be, I think, unfair and just completely wrong to mistake what I said as any sort of support for FGM or anything that people wish to do to their children and claim somehow in my culture this is permissible.
When the government becomes involved in defining and delimiting the sphere of religion, it is inherently and always selective and discriminatory. This applies at the level of the state, and it applies to international instruments and organizations that are said to enforce or interpret those instruments, such as the European Court, for instance, the United Nations to various degrees, various human rights bodies, etc. So yes, I think that it is an inherently flawed project. I think that what we might want to do is rethink the entire history and concept of the construct, which is something I've been trying to do in collaboration with many other colleagues. It's not something anyone could do alone.
We've talked a lot about how to promote the issue, and that's one of the things I really struggle with running the group, because yes, we want to promote the issue, but at the end of the day, I want to see people out of prison. And that to me is how is it that all this, the limited international infrastructure is not getting the traction on the ground for communities that are struggling.
We are having this discussion when we're talking about reaching out the boundaries of religious freedom. How far can it go? Where tonight, people for a whole host of reasons, but including the fact that they wish to worship in private or in public, they wish to hold their belief for a God not accepted by the majority of those around them, which puts them in prison, which puts them in fear of their life, and which robs their family of their birthrights. And I think that is what religious freedom and tolerance is all about. And while we can debate some of the niceties, and we have the luxury of court decisions to help us, don't forget those for whom religious freedom and tolerance means something very, very different this evening.
I think what I've really learnt from this is people feel extremely passionately on both sides of the debate. And actually,
I think you're probably united in your core values. You share the same values about freedom of democracy as the Baroness or Alistair. Why are you therefore so at loggerheads about this issue? Because you think this is a simple thing. You know, you academics are just saying complexify, complexify. There are people who are suffering. We've got to help them right now. Stop getting in the way. You think, no, if you don't attend to the complexities of the history and the actual message that's being delivered and what's the actual impact of pursuing this programme in this way, you're going to store up really long-term bads that are going to be worse than the short-term ameliorations that you're going to deliver now. So you all want the same things, but you've got extremely different views about how to go about it.